In this video, we'll be talking about non-deliverable forwards, NDFs. An NDF can be thought of to be a cash-settled bet on the exchange rate of a currency pair. To understand how NDFs work, let's take the example of a hypothetical emerging market currency. Let's label it as EMC, and let's assume that this emerging market currency, it trades with some form of capital controls around it. This implies that the local government of this emerging market has put in restrictions for the delivery of this currency. Practical examples of such emerging market currencies are number 1, Indian rupee, number 2, Chinese yuan, number 3, Korean won, and number 4, Brazilian real. Okay. Now, in our example, let's bring in a US-based investor. This US-based investor has his local, or let's say accounting currency, set to be USD, and therefore the currency pair that we will be dealing with in this example is USD EMC. In this currency pair, let's assume that USD is the base currency and EMC is the quote currency. This means that any exchange rate that we will be encountering in this example should be interpreted to be the price of 1 unit of USD expressed in EMC. In this currency pair, please remember this, that USD is our deliverable currency and our controlled currency, which is EMC, will be treated to be non-deliverable. Okay. Now, let's assume that our US-based investor has this view that EMC, this currency, will strengthen over the upcoming period of 3 months. Okay. Now, to monetize on this view, an NDF can actually help our US-based investor. An NDF can help our investor get a synthetic long exposure to this currency, which is EMC, without the need of any physical delivery. Okay. Therefore, our investor goes to the NDF market and observes that the 3-month NDF on EMC is trading at this forward exchange rate of 25 EMC per unit USD. Okay, and our investor enters into a long position in this 3-month NDF with a USD notional of 10 million. Okay, now let's do this. Let's try and understand what our investor has positioned himself for. Let's try and understand what sort of payoffs will our investor receive at the end of this 3-month period. Okay. For this purpose, hypothetically speaking, let me assume that I start off with this NDF the same way as I would have had this been not an NDF, but let's say a conventional currency forward, also referred to as an outright. If this was a usual or conventional currency forward, then this long position in this 3-month forward for a USD notional of 10 million would have a cash flow diagram that would have looked something like this. At the end of this 3-month period, our US-based investor would be required to pay 10 million USD and take delivery of 10 million times 25, that means 250 million units of EMC. Remember, this would have been the case if it was a conventional currency forward. Okay, and herein lies the problem. The problem is that EMC, we are assuming, is a non-deliverable currency, and hence our investor will not be able to take this delivery of 250 million EMCs. Therefore, A non-deliverable forward, it does not really go in for a physical settlement such as this one. A non-deliverable forward instead resorts to a cash settlement. Okay, and for this cash settlement to work out, that means for us to be able to calculate the amount of this cash settlement, what we will need is a reference spot exchange rate at the end of this 3-month period. Okay, for this purpose, our US-based investor and the counterparty for this NDF, what they do at the inception of this NDF is that they decide upon, number one, the source of this spot exchange rate, this reference spot exchange rate. This source can be, for example, the central bank quote. This source can be, for example, Reuters. Number two, they decide upon which date will we observe our reference spot exchange rate on. And number three, they decide upon the precise time zone and the time at which this spot exchange rate will be observed. Okay, so let's say when we near the end of this 3-month period, let's say at this point in time, which is 2 business days before the end of this 3-month period, let's say we observe the reference spot exchange rate for USD EMC. And let's say this spot exchange rate works out to be 20 EMC per unit USD, which means that EMC indeed has appreciated and our investors' view indeed did turn out to be correct. Okay. Now, for us to be able to work out the cash settlement amount for this NDF, let's come back to this hypothetically assumed case that our NDF starts off as a conventional currency forward. And to work out the cash settlement amount for this usual currency forward, we will have to close out or unwind this currency forward using an offsetting spot transaction. And our offsetting spot transaction would look something like this. If in our assumed currency forward, our investor was required to pay 10 million USD, in our offsetting spot transaction, our investor is required to receive 10 million USD. So this leg and this leg, these two cash flows, they actually cancel out. If in the original assumed currency forward, our investor was required to receive 250 million EMCs, in the offsetting spot transaction, our investor is required to pay 10 million times the reference spot exchange rate of 20, which means 200 million EMC. Okay, this guy cancel out. The difference of these two is 50 million EMCs. Okay, and now again, remember this, that EMC being a non-deliverable currency, this difference of 50 million EMC needs to be converted to USD at the prevailing reference spot exchange rate of 20. So 50 divided by 20 gives you 2.5 million USD. Okay, therefore, in this particular case, in this particular example, at the end of this 3-month period, if the spot exchange rate, the reference spot exchange rate turned out to be 20, then it is the counterparty for this 3-month NDF which will be required to pay to our US-based investor this sum of money, which is 2.5 million USD. Okay, this was an example scenario where our investor was the winner and our NDF counterparty was the loser, and hence the NDF counterparty paid this amount to our investor. Okay, now observe this, that this cash settlement amount has been worked out in USD, which is our deliverable currency, and it has been worked out using this internal logic that we've just now described here. Okay, now please note this, that if on the other hand EMC had depreciated, which means our reference spot exchange rate turned out to be a number which is greater than 25, then it would have been the US-based investor that would have ended up paying the NDF counterparty the net cash settlement amount, again worked out in USD. Now, to concretize all that we've learned in this simple example, let's take a look at a quick definition of NDFs. NDFs should be thought of to be over-the-counter derivatives contracts that allow foreign investors to, number one, take a view on, and number two, hedge exposures to those currencies which are not physically deliverable. The settlement of NDFs, it happens via a cash settlement, and the cash settlement amount is worked out using the difference between a pre-agreed rate, which is our NDF rate, and the actual price, which is our reference spot exchange rate, which is observed near to or close to the maturity of the NDF. And this cash settlement, it happens in the deliverable currency of our currency pair. Okay, these are the essential aspects about NDFs that you should remember. Before I stop, let me also take you through 3 additional aspects about NDFs that you can also remember. The first aspect is about NDF codes. Please remember this, that unlike conventional forwards, for determining NDF codes, we may not be able to rely on the covered interest rate parity. The reason being that we are talking about a currency here which has restrictions around free movement of capital across borders, and hence we may not be able to rely on the no arbitrage framework which is provided to us by the covered interest rate parity. Instead, please remember this, that NDF codes, they are a reflection of how demand compares with the supply of such a currency in the offshore market. And this demand versus supply can be quite different from the demand versus supply of this currency in the onshore market. Okay? The second aspect to note is about credit risk. When it comes to NDFs, since we are not really exchanging the notionals, or let's say the principles in the two currencies, the same way as it happens in conventional currency forwards, but rather we are exchanging a much smaller net cash settlement amount. Therefore, credit risk in NDFs tends to be much lower compared to conventional currency forwards. Number 3, please remember this, that NDFs, they are associated with some element of tail risk. What does this mean? We are talking about a currency here which has some degree of involvement from the local government. Okay, this involvement comes in the form of managing the exchange rate of such a currency. And the policy around managing the exchange rate of such a currency can undergo a very quick, a very abrupt change. And this can bring about very abrupt and very adverse changes in the spot exchange rate as well as the NDF rates for such emerging market currencies. And these abrupt and adverse changes can very quickly erase and reverse gains that have been accumulated over long periods of market calm. This is what we refer to as tail risk. Okay, this wraps up this video on non-deliverable forwards. If you found this video helpful, please do give it a thumbs up. If you are new to this channel, please do consider subscribing. If you are looking for preparation resources for FRM Part 1 and FRM Part 2 exams, please do visit the homepage of finRGB.com. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.